December 10, 1941. Combined Fleet Headquarters, Hashirajima, Anchorage, Japan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the deck of the battleship Nagato, watching as colliers, coal transport ships approached the anchored fleet. The attack on Pearl Harbor 3 days earlier had been a spectacular success. American battleships destroyed or crippled. The Pacific lay open. But Yamamoto, who had studied and served in America, understood something his jubilant staff officers did not. The celebration was premature. He watched as the laborious process began. Coal, thousands of tons of it being transferred from colliers to the fleet's warships. The process would take 12 to 16 hours per ship. During this time, the ships were immobile, vulnerable, unable to maneuver or fight effectively. Hundreds of sailors, stripped to the waist despite December's chill, would shovel coal from bags, carry it across gangplanks, dump it into bunkers. It was back-breaking, filthy work. Black dust covered everything. Men emerged looking like ghosts, coughing coal dust from their lungs. Yamamoto's gaze shifted to the newer ships in the anchorage. The carriers Akagi and Kaga, the fast battleships Kongo and Haruna, these burned oil, not coal. Their refueling was faster, cleaner, more efficient, but even these ships faced limitations. Japanese oil reserves were critically low. The entire reason for the war, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the invasions of Southeast Asia, was to secure oil. Without it, the fleet would become nothing more than steel monuments anchored in harbors. What Yamamoto didn't know, what none of his staff could have imagined, was that at that very moment, the United States Navy was perfecting a capability that would render Japanese fuel logistics obsolete. Underway replenishment, the ability to refuel ships at sea while moving without entering port. Not just possible, but routine. Not just for a few ships, but for entire fleets. The Americans would turn the ocean itself into a gas station, fueling operations thousands of miles from home base continuously for months. Within 3 years, American task forces would operate in Japanese waters, refueling at sea, while the Japanese fleet remained tethered to ports, waiting days for coal that would never arrive. This is the story of how fuel type, something as mundane as what burned in a ship's boilers, became one of the most decisive technological advantages of the Pacific War. How coal versus oil determined strategic mobility, operational tempo, and ultimately, which navy could project power across the world's largest ocean. The Japanese burned coal and lost their mobility. The Americans burned oil and gained the world. Let me take you back to 1905 and show you how this technological gap developed, widened, and eventually doomed Japan's naval ambitions. In 1905, the Imperial Japanese Navy shocked the world by defeating the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. It was the first time an Asian power had decisively defeated a European power in modern warfare. The victory established Japan as a major naval force and validated their shipbuilding and tactical doctrines. The ships that won at Tsushima burned coal. Every major warship in the world at that time burned coal. It was the standard fuel for naval vessels, had been since steam power replaced sail. Coal had advantages. It was abundant. Japan had domestic coal mines, making them less dependent on foreign supply. Coal was stable, didn't evaporate or leak like oil. It could be stored indefinitely. A ship with coal bunkers full could sit for years and the fuel remained usable. Most importantly, coal technology was mature and well understood. Japanese engineers had mastered coal-fired boilers. Their stokers, the men who shoveled coal into furnaces, were trained and experienced. But coal had severe disadvantages that would become catastrophic as naval warfare evolved. First, coaling a ship was incredibly labor-intensive. A battleship might carry 3,000 tons of coal. Loading this required hundreds of men working for 12 to 16 hours. The coal came in heavy bags, typically 180 pounds each. Men had to carry these bags from colliers, coal transport ships, across gangplanks that swayed with the ocean's movement, then dump the coal into bunkers deep in the ship. It was exhausting, dangerous work. Men fell between ships and drowned. Backs were injured. Heat exhaustion was common, even in winter. The process was also incredibly dirty. Coal dust filled the air, covering everything and everyone. It got into machinery, into ventilation systems, into food stores. Sailors emerged from coaling operations looking like they'd been dipped in ink. The dust caused respiratory problems. Ships that had just coaled were effectively combat ineffective for hours while crews cleaned equipment and themselves. More critically, coaling required the ship to be stationary, usually anchored in a protected harbor. A ship couldn't fight while coaling. It couldn't maneuver. It was completely vulnerable. Second, coal had terrible energy density compared to oil. A ton of coal produced roughly 2/3 the energy of a ton of oil. This meant that for equivalent range, a coal-burning ship needed 50% more fuel weight. This either reduced the ship's range or forced designers to allocate more internal space to fuel storage, reducing space for weapons, armor, or crew facilities. Coal also degraded in storage. It absorbed moisture, reducing its heating value. It could spontaneously combust in bunkers, a constant fire hazard. And as coal burned, it left behind clinker and ash, solid waste that had to be physically removed from furnaces. This required constant manual labor and reduced boiler efficiency over time. Third, coal limited maximum speed and sustained speed. Coal-fired boilers required stokers to manually shovel coal into furnaces. The rate at which they could shovel determined how much steam could be generated. During battle, when maximum power was needed, stokers worked frantically, shoveling tons per hour. But human endurance had limits. After a few hours at maximum effort, stokers collapsed from exhaustion. Ships couldn't maintain flank speed for extended periods because the men physically couldn't continue shoveling fast enough. This meant coal-burning ships had theoretical maximum speeds they could only maintain briefly, not sustained operational speeds. The British Royal Navy, recognizing these limitations, began converting to oil fuel in 1912. First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, championed the conversion despite significant opposition. Britain had abundant coal but no domestic oil, making the conversion strategically risky. But Churchill understood that oil's advantages were overwhelming. Oil could be pumped aboard ships in hours, not days. It could be stored more compactly. It produced more energy per ton. It burned cleaner and more completely. Most importantly, oil could be fed to boilers automatically by pumps, allowing sustained maximum speed without human exhaustion. The United States Navy followed Britain's lead, converting to oil even more aggressively. America had discovered massive oil fields in Texas, California, and Oklahoma. Domestic oil was abundant and cheap. By 1920, the U.S. Navy was designing all new warships as oil burners. Older coal-burning ships were converted to oil when possible or retired when conversion was impractical. By 1930, the entire American battle fleet burned oil exclusively. Japan faced a different calculation. They had domestic coal but virtually no domestic oil. Every drop of oil had to be imported, primarily from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. Converting to oil made Japan strategically vulnerable. If oil imports were cut off, the fleet would be immobilized. This wasn't theoretical paranoia. It was exactly what happened. American oil embargoes in 1941 crippled Japan's ability to fuel its military, directly precipitating the attack on Pearl Harbor. So Japan compromised. Newer ships, particularly carriers and fast battleships built in the 1930s, burned oil for maximum performance. But older battleships, many cruisers, and numerous smaller vessels continued burning coal. By 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy operated a mixed fuel fleet. Some ships burned coal, some burned oil, some burned both in combination. This created a logistics nightmare. Fleets couldn't operate at maximum efficiency because different ships had different refueling requirements and different refueling times. More critically, Japan's oil reserves were catastrophically insufficient for sustained warfare. In 1941, Japan's total oil reserves, military and civilian combined, amounted to approximately 50 million barrels. The military consumed roughly 12 million barrels annually just for routine operations. Combat operations increased consumption dramatically. Japanese planners calculated they had perhaps 18 months of oil for war operations before reserves were exhausted. The entire strategic premise of Japanese expansion into Southeast Asia was to capture the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, Borneo, and Burma. Without that oil, the war was already lost before it began. The United States faced no such constraints. America produced 4 million barrels of oil daily in 1941. That's 4 million barrels per day, not per year. American daily production exceeded Japan's total reserves. The disparity was so enormous that Japanese planners simply couldn't comprehend it. They assumed American figures were exaggerated or propaganda. They were not. America had so much oil that fueling the entire Pacific Fleet was barely noticeable in national production statistics. But oil abundance alone wasn't the decisive advantage. The decisive advantage was what America did with that oil: underway replenishment, the ability to transfer fuel from tankers to warships while both ships were moving at sea. This capability transformed naval operations from port-based to ocean-based. Ships no longer needed to return to port to refuel. Tankers came to them. Fleets could remain at sea for months, operating continuously, refueling whenever needed without interrupting operations. The technology for underway replenishment existed before the war but was rare and difficult. The basic concept was straightforward. A tanker and a warship steamed parallel courses, typically 120 to 150 feet apart. A line was shot from one ship to the other using a line-throwing gun. This light line was used to pull across heavier cables, which in turn pulled across a fueling hose. Once connected, pumps on the tanker pushed oil through the hose into the warship's tanks. In theory, simple. In practice, extraordinarily difficult. Both ships had to maintain precise course and speed for hours. Any deviation risked collision or breaking the fuel line. The ships were close enough that waves or wind could push them together, potentially causing catastrophic damage. The fuel hose, several hundred feet long and filled with oil, weighed tons and hung in a catenary curve between ships. If it broke, hot oil sprayed across both ships, creating fire hazards. Night operations were even more dangerous, requiring perfect coordination in darkness with only minimal lights. Before the war, underway refueling was considered an emergency measure, used only when absolutely necessary. The risks seemed too high for routine use. The Japanese experimented with the technique, but never developed it operationally. Japanese doctrine assumed fleets would operate from forward bases, refueling in port. This made strategic sense given their geographic position. Japan controlled island chains across the Pacific that could serve as refueling bases. They didn't need underway replenishment if they controlled ports throughout their operational area. The Americans took a different approach. They assumed war in the Pacific would require operations thousands of miles from American ports. They assumed Japan would control forward bases, at least initially. Therefore, American fleets needed to be self-sufficient, able to operate without depending on shore facilities. This meant perfecting underway replenishment, making it routine rather than emergency procedure. Captain William Callaghan, commanding officer of the USS Guadalupe, an oiler attached to the Pacific Fleet, supervised some of the first operational underway refueling exercises in early 1942. His reports, preserved in Navy archives, describe the learning process. Our first attempts were failures. Lines parted, ships collided, fuel spilled across decks. We damaged equipment and endangered crews. Senior officers questioned whether the technique was worth the risk, but we persisted. We refined procedures, improved equipment, trained crews specifically for underway operations. By June 1942, we could refuel a destroyer in 2 hours while maintaining 15 knots. By 1943, we could refuel multiple ships simultaneously, including battleships. By 1944, underway refueling was so routine we did it at night in rough weather while under threat of air attack. The impact on naval operations was revolutionary. American carrier task forces could remain at sea for 60 to 90 days consecutively. They would launch strikes against Japanese positions, retire to refuel at sea from accompanying tankers, then launch more strikes without ever entering port. Japanese forces faced an enemy that appeared inexhaustible, capable of attacking continuously without pause. Japanese commanders calculated when American forces would need to retire for resupply, planning their operations around those assumed withdrawal periods. The Americans never withdrew. They just refueled at sea and continued operating. The statistics are staggering. During 1944, the Pacific Fleet consumed over 200 million barrels of fuel oil. Not one barrel of that required American ships to return to Pearl Harbor or mainland ports for refueling. Every drop was delivered by tankers to ships at sea. The fleet tanker force grew to over 400 vessels, including fleet oilers, gasoline tankers for aviation fuel, and converted merchant tankers. These ships operated on continuous rotations, traveling from West Coast ports to forward areas, refueling combat ships, then returning to port for their own refueling before cycling back. Let me tell you about one specific operation that demonstrates the advantage. Operation Forager, the invasion of the Mariana Islands in June 1944, involved Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force. This force included 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. Over 100 warships operating over 3,000 miles from Pearl Harbor. The operation lasted from June 6th to August 10th, over 2 months. During this time, Task Force 58 remained at sea continuously, launching thousands of combat sorties, participating in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, supporting amphibious landings and bombarding shore targets. The fleet refueled at sea every 4 to 6 days. Each refueling evolution involved dozens of ships simultaneously taking on thousands of tons of fuel oil and aviation gasoline. The tankers themselves were refueled from other tankers in a cascading system. Forward tankers refueled combat ships. Rear tankers refueled forward tankers. Transport ships from the West Coast refueled rear tankers. The entire system operated like a pipeline, pumping oil from California refineries directly into carrier fuel tanks 3,000 miles away without ever stopping. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, wrote in his after-action report, "The ability to refuel at sea has transformed carrier operations. We are no longer constrained by fuel range. We can position ourselves optimally for any objective, refuel as needed, and continue operations indefinitely. The enemy must guess our location and intentions. We can strike, withdraw, refuel, and strike again before they can react. This operational flexibility is decisive. The Japanese had no counter to this capability. Their fleet operations remained tethered to port facilities. Japanese carriers could operate for perhaps 7 to 10 days before needing to return to port for refueling and resupply. This predictability allowed American submarines to position themselves near Japanese bases, knowing Japanese ships would eventually have to return. It also meant Japanese operations were episodic rather than continuous. Launch an operation, return to port, resupply, launch another operation. Weeks could pass between operations due to refueling requirements. More critically, Japanese tankers became priority targets for American submarines. Every tanker sunk removed not just the oil it carried, but the capacity to transport oil. By 1944, Japanese tanker losses exceeded new construction. The oil might exist in Dutch East Indies fields, but Japan couldn't transport it to where it was needed. The fleet literally ran out of fuel while sitting in port. Ships that burned oil couldn't leave harbor because there was no oil. Ships that burned coal couldn't leave harbor because there were no colliers to deliver coal. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 illustrated the strategic impact of fuel constraints. The Japanese Navy launched its largest operation of the war, committing virtually every operational warship to disrupt the American invasion of the Philippines. The plan was complex, involving multiple forces converging from different directions. One of those forces, the Northern Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, included Japan's remaining carriers. These carriers had almost no aircraft aboard. Japan had lost most of its carrier aircraft and trained pilots in earlier battles and couldn't replace them. But the ships themselves were still operational, so they were used as decoys. Ozawa's mission was to lure American carriers north, away from the landing beaches, sacrificing his ships to allow Japanese battleships to attack the invasion force. It was a suicide mission, and Ozawa knew it. But before the battle even began, fuel shortages nearly aborted the operation. Ozawa's ships had barely enough fuel to reach the operational area. There was no fuel for maneuvering, no fuel for high-speed operations, no fuel for a return voyage. The plan assumed the ships would be sunk, so return fuel wasn't allocated. This wasn't tactical audacity. It was desperation born of empty fuel tanks. The Southern Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, faced similar constraints. Nishimura's battleships had fuel for the voyage to Leyte Gulf and perhaps 1 day of combat operations. After that, they would be out of fuel. There was no reserve, no margin for unexpected developments. When Nishimura's force was ambushed in Surigao Strait by American battleships on the night of October 24th, his ships fought to the death partly because they literally didn't have fuel to retreat. Both battleships, Fuso and Yamashiro, were sunk. Nishimura died on Yamashiro's bridge. His ships had steamed into a trap they couldn't escape even if they'd wanted to, because empty fuel tanks left only one direction: forward into enemy guns. The center force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, included Japan's super battleship Yamato and her sister Musashi. These were the largest, most powerful battleships ever built. Yamato displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded and mounted 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever deployed. She was designed to outfight any ship afloat, but her massive engines consumed fuel at prodigious rates. At maximum speed, Yamato burned 200 tons of fuel oil per hour. Her fuel tanks held 6,300 tons, giving her roughly 30 hours at flank speed or about a week at cruising speed. When Kurita's force departed Brunei on October 22nd for the voyage to Leyte Gulf, the ships were not fully fueled. There wasn't enough oil in Brunei to top off the tanks. Yamato left port at 70% capacity. Other ships were even lower. The plan assumed they would either win at Leyte, capturing American fuel stocks, or die trying. There was no plan for return to base because there was no fuel for return. On October 24th, American carrier aircraft attacked Kurita's force in the Sibuyan Sea. Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, took massive damage. 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits over the course of 4 hours. She sank in the evening, taking over 1,000 crew with her. But the attacks forced Kurita to maneuver at high speed for hours, burning fuel he couldn't replace. By nightfall, Kurita's ships had expended significant fuel reserves simply dodging attacks, before ever reaching the combat area. On October 25th, Kurita's force surprised American escort carriers off Samar Island. This should have been Japan's moment of victory. Kurita had 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers against 6 small escort carriers, protected by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. The Americans were completely outgunned. Yamato's single main gun turret threw more metal than all American ships combined. For 2 hours, Kurita's forces chased the Americans, scoring hits, sinking ships. Victory seemed certain. Then Kurita broke off the attack. He ordered his forces to withdraw, abandoning the pursuit when the enemy was on the verge of complete destruction. His decision has been debated for decades. Some historians argue he lost his nerve, others that he misidentified American ships as larger units than they actually were. But Kurita's own report mentions fuel status as a factor. His ships had been at sea for 3 days, maneuvering constantly, fighting continuously. Fuel tanks were approaching 40%. If he continued south toward the landing beaches, there would be insufficient fuel for the return voyage. He would achieve a tactical victory, but lose his ships because they'd run out of fuel before reaching friendly ports. Kurita chose to withdraw while he still had fuel to reach Brunei. The Japanese lost the Battle of Leyte Gulf, lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. They lost control of the Philippines. They lost the war's largest naval battle. And one factor in that loss was empty fuel tanks that turned tactical flexibility into strategic rigidity. Meanwhile, American forces at Leyte Gulf refueled at sea. Task Force 38, the American carrier force, refueled on October 22nd, again on October 25th, and again on October 27th. 3 major refueling operations in 6 days while conducting combat operations. Admiral William Halsey, commanding 3rd Fleet, never considered fuel status a constraint. When his carriers ran low, tankers appeared and pumped oil while operations continued. The Americans had more fuel available off Leyte Gulf than Japan had in all its remaining reserves. The contrast extended beyond warships. American submarines operating around Japan and along Japanese supply routes remained on station for 60 days or more per patrol. Japanese submarines, constrained by fuel, typically managed 30-day patrols. This meant American submarines were in position when targets appeared. Japanese submarines were often in transit to or from patrol areas, spending more time traveling than hunting. American submarines also had another fuel advantage. They carried spare torpedoes and fuel for those torpedoes in quantities Japanese submarines couldn't match. An American fleet submarine carried 24 torpedoes. A Japanese submarine carried 17 to 20. American submarines could remain on patrol until they'd expended all torpedoes. Japanese submarines often had to return with remaining torpedoes because they'd exhausted fuel before expending weapons. By 1945, the fuel disparity had become catastrophic for Japan. The combined fleet remained in port not from battle damage or lack of ships, but from lack of fuel. Yamato, the world's most powerful battleship, sat at Kure Naval Base effectively immobilized. When she was finally dispatched on her last mission, Operation Tengo, in April 1945, she carried fuel for a one-way voyage to Okinawa. The plan was explicitly a suicide mission. She would beach herself and fight as a stationary fortress until destroyed. There was no fuel for return, so no return was planned. American aircraft found and sank Yamato on April 7, 1945, before she reached Okinawa. She took 10 torpedo and 7 bomb hits, capsizing and exploding. Over 3,000 crew died. The mission achieved nothing except demonstrating Japan's complete fuel exhaustion. They sent their mightiest ship on a mission with no possibility of return because they had no fuel for any other option. Let me tell you about the human dimension of this fuel disparity, because the statistics obscure the human cost. Japanese sailors and stokers who worked with coal experienced conditions American sailors never faced. Coaling ship was universally hated duty. An account from Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, serving aboard the cruiser Megami, describes the process. "We received word we would coal ship the next day. Everyone groaned. We knew what it meant. 18 hours of hell. We began at dawn. The collier pulled alongside. We rigged lines and platforms. Then the work began. The coal came across in bags, each bag 80 kilograms, heavy enough that one man could barely lift it. We formed human chains. Pass the bag, lift it, pass it forward, hour after hour. The coal dust rose in clouds. You couldn't see 3 meters. You couldn't breathe without inhaling dust. It coated your skin, your hair, got into your eyes. Men collapsed from exhaustion and heat. We rotated every hour, but even an hour was torture. By evening, every man was black. Our hands were raw and bleeding from the rough bags. We'd consumed thousands of kilograms of coal, but the bunkers were only half full. The work continued into the night under floodlights. We finally finished near midnight, 18 hours. We'd loaded 3,000 tons. The ship was filthy. We were filthy. It took another day to clean the ship and ourselves. 2 days to refuel one cruiser. Compare that to an American destroyer refueling at sea. Signalman 3rd Class Robert Henderson, serving aboard USS Nicholas, described the process in a letter home. "We refueled today from a tanker. The whole thing took about 2 hours. We pulled up alongside the oiler, matched her speed, shot lines across. They sent over the fuel hose. We connected it to our refueling port. Their pumps started and oil flowed into our tanks. We stayed 100 feet away, just cruising along at 15 knots. Some guys played cards on deck while we refueled. Others wrote letters. I watched the ocean. 2 hours later, the hose disconnected. We waved to the tanker crew and went back to our position in the formation. Nobody even got dirty. If that's the hard part of war, I'll take it." The efficiency gap extended to fleet operations. A Japanese fleet anchored for coaling required 3 to 4 days. Day 1, assemble colliers and position ships. Day 2, coal the battleships and cruisers, the priority vessels. Day 3, coal the destroyers and smaller ships. Day 4, clean ships and resume operations. During these 4 days, the fleet was vulnerable, immobile, and combat ineffective. An American fleet refueled at sea in hours, sometimes continuing refueling operations while under air attack. On March 11, 1945, Task Force 58 was refueling near Ulithi when Japanese kamikaze aircraft attacked. The carriers Randolph and Enterprise were hit, but the refueling continued. Destroyers finished taking on fuel even as anti-aircraft guns fired at attackers. The task force completed refueling, treated the damaged carriers, and launched retaliatory strikes against Japanese bases, all within 24 hours. No return to port, no operational pause, just continuous operations despite being attacked during refueling. Japanese logistics officers studied American capabilities and wrote reports filled with despair. A captured document from the staff of the combined fleet, dated August 1944, contains this assessment. Enemy fuel logistics are incomprehensible by our standards. They operate continuously without port calls. Their consumption must be enormous, yet they never seem to lack fuel. We intercept their radio communications, and they discuss refueling casually, as if it were no different from changing watch. Our fleet must carefully husband every liter of oil. We calculate fuel for each mission down to the margin of safety. The Americans appear to calculate nothing. They simply refuel whenever convenient. This abundance is demoralizing to our crews, who understand we cannot compete with such resources. The psychological impact on Japanese sailors was severe. They could see American ships operating freely while their own ships sat immobile waiting for fuel that never came. They watched their comrades die on suicide missions flown because there wasn't fuel for a return trip. They understood their side was losing not from lack of courage or skill, but from empty fuel tanks. By August 1945, when the war ended, the Imperial Japanese Navy existed largely on paper. Ships floated at anchor or sat in dry dock, but they couldn't sortie because there was no fuel. Training stopped because there was no fuel for training exercises. The fleet that had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor, that had conquered Southeast Asia in 6 months, that had fought desperately for 4 years, ended the war paralyzed by fuel starvation. The American Pacific Fleet, meanwhile, was operating at peak capacity. Task Force 38 was conducting strikes against the Japanese home islands, refueling at sea routinely, operating with such complete dominance that their main challenge was finding targets. When the atomic bombs fell and Japan surrendered, American ships steamed into Tokyo Bay with full fuel tanks, having refueled at sea the day before from tankers that immediately left to refuel more ships. The statistics from the end of the war tell the story with brutal clarity. American fuel oil reserves in August 1945 exceeded 700 million barrels. Production continued at over 4 million barrels daily. The Pacific Fleet had consumed roughly 300 million barrels during the war and had larger reserves at war's end than at the beginning. Japanese fuel oil reserves in August 1945 were approximately 200,000 barrels, less than 1 day's American production. Most Japanese ships hadn't moved in months because there was no fuel. Remaining fuel was reserved for kamikaze aircraft and suicide boats, one-way weapons that didn't need fuel for return trips. The story of coal versus oil, of hours to refuel versus days to refuel, of underway replenishment versus port dependence, is ultimately a story about industrial capacity and strategic vision. Japan chose to retain coal-burning ships because they had coal and lacked oil. This seemed prudent, even necessary, given their resource constraints. But it locked them into a logistics system that couldn't support their strategic ambitions. America chose oil because they had oil abundance and recognized that operational flexibility mattered more than fuel security. They then developed underway refueling, not because they needed it initially, but because they foresaw needing it in a Pacific War. By the time war came, American capabilities had evolved beyond what Japanese planners had imagined possible. The result was that Japan fought a war of scarce resources carefully rationed, every operation constrained by fuel calculations, every tactical decision influenced by how much oil remained in the tanks. America fought a war of abundant resources casually dispensed, operations limited only by imagination and enemy resistance, fuel never a primary consideration because more was always available. In post-war interrogations, Japanese naval officers repeatedly cited fuel shortages as the most crippling constraint they faced. Not American combat power, though that certainly mattered. Not industrial production, though that was overwhelming. But simply the inability to fuel their ships, to position their fleet, to operate freely because every movement burned irreplaceable oil. Vice Admiral Matomugaki, Chief of Staff to Admiral Yamamoto and later commander of the 5th Air Fleet, kept a detailed diary throughout the war. After Japan's surrender, American translators found this entry from June 1945. "We have ships but no fuel. We have aircraft but no fuel. We have brave men willing to die, but we cannot send them into battle because we have no fuel to move them to the battle. The Americans steam wherever they wish, attack whatever they choose, retreat when convenient, advance when opportune. They are not better sailors than we are. They are not braver than our men. They simply have fuel and we do not. In the end, wars are won by logistics, not by courage. We had courage. They had oil. Oil wins." That assessment, written by one of Japan's most experienced naval officers, captures the fundamental truth of the Pacific War's naval dimension. Technology mattered, training mattered, tactics mattered, but fuel mattered most. The side that could refuel in 20 minutes instead of 20 hours, that could refuel at sea instead of in port, that could refuel continuously instead of episodically, gained strategic mobility that translated into operational flexibility that enabled tactical success. Japan's battleships burned coal and measured refueling time in days. America's fleet burned oil and measured refueling time in hours. That difference, multiplied across 4 years and thousands of operations, determined who could project power across the Pacific and who slowly strangled in port waiting for fuel that never came. The story of fuel in the Pacific War is ultimately a reminder that wars are won by logistics as much as by fighting. The most powerful battleship ever built, Yamato, died not in glorious combat against equal opponents, but in a futile suicide mission fueled with just enough oil for one way. She sank because Japan couldn't fuel her, couldn't base her, couldn't use her, even though she floated and her guns worked. Empty fuel tanks defeat the mightiest weapons. American carriers ruled the Pacific not just because they were well-designed or well-commanded, but because they could refuel every few days without returning to port, operating continuously for months while Japanese carriers had to return home every week. American submarines strangled Japan's merchant fleet not just because they had better torpedoes, but because they could stay on station for 2 months while Japanese submarines spent half their time in transit due to fuel constraints. So here's the final truth that Japanese admirals learned and American admirals understood from the beginning. In naval warfare across history's largest ocean, the fleet that can stay at sea longest wins. Oil let America stay at sea. Coal forced Japan to stay in port. That simple fact, more than any battle or campaign, decided who would control the Pacific. Japan's battleships burned coal and lost their mobility. America's fleet burned oil and gained the world. The difference was measured in hours for refueling. But those hours added up to years of operational advantage that decided everything. If you just discovered how something as simple as fuel type decided the Pacific War, how hours versus days for refueling gave America unstoppable strategic mobility, how underway replenishment let American fleets operate continuously while Japanese ships sat immobilized waiting for fuel that never came, then subscribe to War Rewind. We bring you daily deep dives into the untold technological and logistical gaps that actually won World War II. Hit that like button if this changed how you see naval warfare. And comment below, what shocked you most? That Japan still used coal in World War II, that refueling at sea was possible, or that Yamato died on a one-way mission because Japan had no fuel for her return. Tomorrow we reveal another decisive technological gap the history books overlooked. Until then, remember that the side with the fuel usually wins, and the side that can refuel the fastest wins everything.